First of all, I need to apologize to residents of the great state of Nevada. I was a little bit harsh. Um, I think there were many contributing factors to the negative experience I had driving through Nevada. I mean, just beginning my road trip and only stopping in select places, to charge and just, not really seeing the state at its best. But I did say in my last video that there is something beautiful about the desert landscape. And, I experienced that and I understand why people love it. So I got a little carried away. But today I've been engaging in a back and forth about a couple of issues, the Electoral College being one of them, and also thinking about nationalism. And I was listening to Keith Woods on YouTube talk about how he, as a traditionalist, social nationalist, those are his words, how he views the human situation right now on planet Earth. For him, and the reason I'm interested in Keith Woods is that he is anti-capitalist and recognizes the importance of resisting the expansion of capitalism, the commodification of more and more of the earth and more of the human realm, both our bodies colonizing, commodifying our bodies and our minds and our culture. And so I share with Keith this desire to attempt to wrestle power from the capitalist world order, from neoliberalism. But, what I don't seem to share with Keith is this insistence upon racialized forms of nationalism, ethno-nationalism, if you will. And, we can talk about the differences between conceptions of race versus conception of ethnicity, the former being usually more biologically rooted and the latter being more about social and cultural activity and construction. Shared experience, right? That's what we mean by ethnicity, whereas and shared history, whereas when we speak in terms of race, it's more of this biological conception of a genetic determinant that divides up the peoples of this planet into separate groups, almost as if separate species, and that we should be segregated because these genetic differences are somehow imagined to be fixed, right? But of course, evolution shakes up our sense of both human culture and the natural biological dimension of our beings. Evolution forces us to conceive of how these two, how culture and nature could actually be features of the same process rather than entirely separate domains. And so, Keith and I do not share an ontology or a metaphysical scheme. I think Keith is more aligned with a sort of perennialist view or traditionalist view that there are eternal truths, and while they may manifest differently in different historical epochs, they are still eternal in their origins, in their principles. And, I think I don't deny I'm not a nominalist. I don't deny the reality of ideas, and indeed eternal ideas. But the question for me becomes how we as finite human creatures are to relate to these eternal ideas in the context of embodied coexistence as members of communities which are constitutive of our own identities. I don't deny the importance of identity and individuality, whether of individual persons or individual peoples, right? Folk souls, if you want. Individuality, identity, absolutely essential. But identity is always constructed in relationship. Identities don't precede relationships, right? And, one of the other ways that Keith and I differ metaphysically is that he's critical of, the way that capitalism quantifies everything, nature and humanity, in the process of commodification. Capital is quantifying, and it's eliminating qualities, he says. And so he's trying to rebel against the quantification of life and affirm the values of the sort of irreducible qualitative dimension of reality. And, I would want to think more dialectically about quantity and quality, because yes, preserving concrete individual differences is something that I would also, assent to and agree with Keith about. But in order to understand what we mean by a concrete individual, I think we need both the categories of quantity and quality, right? Because quantities allow us, thinking in terms of quantity allows us to think in terms of numbers, including the number one. What is an entity? What is a unity? What is singularity? Because if we can't think in terms of, what it means to be a single one, then how can we think in terms of unique qualities either? So in order to think about how quantity and quality, how, and qualities too are often universals, right? They're all often these generic characteristics. When you describe a people, you're describing, or an individual, you're describing personality traits or national characteristics, which could also apply to other peoples because they are universals. And so if you're purely qualitative in your thinking, your thinking is going to be pretty abstract, right? Just as if you're purely quantitative, your thinking is going to be a bit too abstract. So we need both, and I think a more dialectical way of integrating quality and quantity is what's needed here, which is not in any way an apology for capitalism, right? Everything Keith says about the way that capitalism is extracting and thus degrading the life quality of the planet is, as far as I'm concerned, completely accurate. And I find him compelling because of the power of his critique of capitalism. But the reason that I am concerned, I don't want to be a concern troll or something. The reason, maybe I should phrase it differently. The reason that I feel compelled to, disagree with Keith about his alternative to capitalism is that I feel like it negates the contingency of our humanity and the contingency and relationality of our sense of identity. Because again, yes, difference, identity, these are important values and they need to be preserved. And I'm not in favor of the homogenization of culture in service of some global capitalist project to turn everything into, via technological means, a farm for harvesting profit. That, to me, is the worst dystopia that the human imagination, can conceive of. And that's where we're rushing headlong, despite all the evidence that capitalism is destroying the planet and the human. So, I'm on board with Keith there. I just think our nature as human beings is queerer than it might first appear. And when we want to talk about eternal truth, when you look at anthropology, you study the history and the evolution of our species, we have had many forms of many ways of organizing ourselves. And maybe there are some orienting generalizations that we might want to say are structurally human, and I think some of those might be the fact that like each of us is born out of a woman, a mother, who then socializes us through eye contact and facial interaction and transaction. And so that what is the closest thing we could have to a universal description of human nature? Well, it would be this developmental process, and the mother-child relationship, I think, is universal, even in cultures where, there isn't a nuclear family structure around the birthing parent. So, there are ways to get at, and there's archetypal fatherhood and archetypal motherhood, but there's archetypal structures. There are a diversity of archetypal structures, and I think it's important to pay respect to the family nuclear structure as a potent norm that has shepherded human evolution in some places on this planet. It has shepherded our evolution and served us in some ways and held us back in other ways, right? And so it's not like I would just want to destroy the family or something, but I think there's also ways in which we need to be open to the further evolution of human sociality, the further evolution of human reproduction. And I'm not a techno-optimist. I'm not a transhumanist. I'm not suggesting that it's a good idea for us to take technological control over sexuality and gender. I'm saying there's more than one way to be natural. And so when we talk about natural law, like what do we mean by nature? Because when I think of nature, the physical world, the actually existing cosmos, I don't see a law-abiding process. I see the wild proliferation of promiscuous differences, right? In other words, differences that are always relating to one another and mutually transforming in the process of relating, such that, we're never separate from one another. Identity is never strongest when it's isolated from other identities. Identity is most alive and dynamic when it is in deep relationship to others, right? And so I think a totally different politics follows from this ontology. I would call it a process relational ontology. And it seems like Keith is still trying to construct his politics out of a eternalist, substantial, hierarchical ontology. My ontology is democratic, and his is monarchical, ultimately, it seems to me, and I'm hoping he's willing to correct me by responding to this video. Well, thanks for listening.